use your diagnosis as an idol? Hey there, I am Danielle Zapchenk, and I appreciate you joining me today on the Parable Podcast. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Director of Administration and Youth Initiatives for the Florida Independent Living Council, Sarah Goldman. She shares about how she moved out of the diagnosis mindset into advocating for future generations with disabilities.
That sort of attitude of like, oh Lord, I got this, when he's sitting right next to me, and I just somehow put myself above him and make myself bigger than who he is, when ultimately he is above the name above all names. And so just over and over again, he has to humble me. And sometimes the hardest way is to say, no, Sarah, I'm right here, and I'm going to teach you the same lesson over and over, and I've never left you.
Here's my conversation with Sarah Goldman. Thrilled to introduce you to Sarah Goldman. Sarah and I met through a coaching call. She has hung out with us at Women's Speaker Collective Boot Camp. And so I am thoroughly excited to hear your story, Sarah. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, I'd be curious to know, is there a time, like if you're looking through like the last couple of months of your life, where you felt like, okay, I feel like I'm in the right place at the right time? Or is that like, no, that never happens to me?
No, I feel like that happens to me more frequently than not.
Awesome. Yeah. What would be like an example of that for you where you're like, I felt that?
So for my full-time job, I work at a nonprofit that serves people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And more specifically, I work with youth and the next generation of leaders with disabilities. And so as part of my job, I run a leadership forum every summer in our state capital. We bring students with disabilities from all over Florida. And it's just a week where they get to learn how to advocate for themselves. They learn how to use their voice. They find their identity as people with disabilities. And so to watch some of the transformations that happened that week, specifically, we had a boy with cerebral palsy, which is my diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And it was his first time away from home. He learned how to use caregivers and said, like, I am now going to be able to live away from home. Mm-hmm. And I think that without sharing that experience to be able to give to other people, God just reminded me that he could use me to be able to impact the next generation.
Wow. I love that. Sarah, forgive me. Is cerebral palsy something that is upon birth?
Yeah, it is a birth injury. Okay. My story is kind of unique. And this is another way I feel like God has really shown up in my life and just taught me that my identity is in him and not a diagnosis. But I was a full-term birth. So usually people that have cerebral palsy are born prematurely, or they have lack of oxygen to the brain. And there's usually a lot of complications. And for me, I was just pulled out with forceps. And so I was a full-term baby. I was talking way too much, but I wasn't hitting other developmental milestones. And that's how my parents knew that something was off. But to this day, we'll never really know what happened because my story is so different, but God's given me a lot of peace in that.
I love that for you. Sarah, talk to me a little bit about what community looks like for you. What does community mean to you as well?
Community for me is kind of twofold. It's like the disability community, but then also knowing that I can have a community outside of disability and that that's so healthy and so needed. And so I do have several close friends with disability. I'm actually the co-visionary of Even If Ministries, which is an online ministry that serves women with physical disabilities and chronic illnesses from across the globe. And so that's a huge community for me. And we do weekly Bible study, worship nights. We have a big conference in April. Everything is done virtually for the women with disabilities. And then community just day in and day out in my hometown is from church. And I lead a community group, and I'm so thankful to just be plugged in with some really solid Christian women.
You know, you talked about advocating and also that younger generation. And you also said, I love that you said it was like through him, it wasn't just about a diagnosis, that your identity is found in Christ. And like, did that advocacy part, was that always a part of your story? Is that something new that has been encouraged and has flourished over the last couple of years?
So when I went to the Passion Conference, this had to be back in 2012 or 2013, I was originally going to be an education major, wanted to be a teacher, just like my mom. And then the Lord really just showed me during that time at Passion that my call was to help fight for justice for people that didn't have a voice. And I came back, switched my major to social work, and knew that disability advocacy was going to be the avenue in which he could use me to represent a whole generation, not only my generation, but the generations to come.
Sarah, would you say that Jesus was known for you at a young age, or did that come later on?
It came later on. I actually didn't become a believer until I was in college.
Okay.
I grew up in a family, I was raised Catholic, and my dad is actually Jewish. So I was raised Catholic, got baptized and confirmed in the Catholic Church. And it wasn't until college that I thought that I was just seeking something more. Like I'd always knew in the back of my head, like, well, God is real. You grew up Catholic, but didn't know what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus. And so through community and through just Bible studies, I was able to discover more of who he was and how his transformation could happen in my heart.
Sarah, the Parable podcast is really about a place for stories. And I mean, you already shared like 3 right there, but I think it's so good for us to take a moment to reassess, look at our life and be like, okay, I see where in this certain season, this certain part of my life that God had taught me a lesson. So sometimes we're kind of in the middle of it. Sometimes we're on the other side. And so I'd love to hear one of your parable stories today.
Sure. And this kind of goes with how I found Jesus. And I feel like a lot of times people do have that defining moment where they accepted Jesus. And that is like, I can pinpoint the exact day and the exact time. But for me, there never really was a specific day. And for a while that bothered me. I'm like, Lord, you have saved me from so much, but I don't have that defining moment. And it was in college that I read John 9, and it was about the man born blind. In verse 3, where it says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. That was a complete game changer for my life. And I think is still something that God is showing me. He takes the blind man then to the pool and covers his eyes in clay. And that was, or mud. And that is the pool of Siloam. And that means sent. And so it's just a reminder for me that God is using my disability for his glory and that I am sent on mission because of that. Like it wasn't an accident that he created my circumstances. And yes, he could heal me in an instant. And I believe that. But I also think that God is using my suffering and my circumstances for his glory, which is why he hasn't chosen to heal me. And that's okay.
You know, you say using my suffering, but I'm sure that that wasn't like an overnight, like, great, I'm so thrilled about this. Talk to me a little bit about how you, Sarah, have processed using your suffering. And I'm sure that that is over the course of time. What does that look like for you?
It is ongoing. I battle my suffering daily, and it's not something I like. I think all of us could say that we don't like suffering, but as far as I have processed it, it's that God uses my utter weakness to depend on him, and he puts me in situations where I don't have a choice but to depend on him in my actual weakness. So not being able to walk, utilizing caregivers that get me dressed or help me take a shower. Those are things where I couldn't even get out of bed on my own every day. And so it is so hard to depend on people. It is so hard to surrender that control and want to take that back and be independent. But God's like has to humble me daily and say, Sarah, you are weak, but this is for my glory. And I'm going to use you because of this weakness.
Now, before you ever came to understand a relationship with Jesus, you know, you said it was a college age. What was that part of your life like? How was the day-to-day feelings? Did you have this sense of hope, or did you feel like you were like searching for this over and over?
I felt like I always had some type of optimism. Like I've always just been a very optimistic person, but there was never that peace. So I remember feeling very bitter about things. I remember feeling more hopeless or depressed, but always trying to keep that, but everything's going to be okay attitude. But then when I came to know Jesus, it was like, I have this hope that regardless of what happens in my life, like that hope is so firm and so secure that it cannot be taken from me. And it doesn't mean that I don't get discouraged or I still don't get mad, but knowing my hope in the midst of my circumstances, I honestly don't know how I did that before coming to know Jesus.
What would you hope that somebody, when they encounter somebody within their church or their workplace or their community that has a disability, what do you wish that they would know about that? That just be like, can you please open your eyes to this?
So many. We could have a whole podcast on that. In very specifically in church settings too. But I think the number one thing I would say is that just treat a person as a person. It doesn't matter their developmental level. It doesn't matter their level of physical ability. Everybody has the concept of understanding the gospel, even in the most simple ways. And nobody is disqualified from hearing the gospel. And so I just feel like more churches in particular need to know that because we all want salvation for the people that we know and are in community with. And it's just as important for the disabled population.
What do you think by working in the job that you have now, working with youth, just helping them find their identity and like in a role of leadership and advocacy, what have you learned about yourself through that role? And also how long have you been in that role?
I've been there for 4 years. And before that, I actually worked in our state capitol. I worked for 2 state representatives and was able to help pass some disability legislation here in Florida. So I think with the youth now, it's helping them to know that their identity, yes, people might have told them their whole life that they can't do things. And yes, they might believe all these negative things about themselves, but they do have gifts and talents that I feel like is part of my responsibility to help them find. Because once they know who they are, they can then go and make a change in the world moving forward.
You know, you talked about, not being identified just by your diagnosis. If somebody just feels like that's their role to play, that's their title, what would be your encouragement to them to kind of help move them out of that mindset?
I think if we're not careful, sometimes our even diagnoses can become an idol. And so for me, like being disabled is part of my life, but it is not my entire life. And so what I would encourage other people to do is really to think about the other components of who they are and how God has made them to be outside of disability or outside of a diagnosis, and to really focus on that rather than idolizing maybe some really hard circumstances. And that's when you just zero in on that and you get tunnel vision and can't see outside of it, that's where bitterness and resentment comes in and often can be used to even be resentful to the Lord.
One of the things that I find really challenging for myself is being able to dream and think about the future, just because I love tasks, I love lists, and I'm like, I just want to get stuff done. And so when somebody's like, I'd love for you to just dream where you'd like to go, that is really hard. And it's kind of laughable at times. So for you, Sarah, what is something that if you could take yourself out for a moment and just kind of dream ahead for what the future holds for you, what you like, maybe those passion projects or something that you're interested in, what would that be?
Gosh, I feel like there's so many dreams that I have. I would love to be our first state representative in Florida that has a physical disability. That is the ultimate dream. But I also think that God has given me a lot of dreams, even in ministry, and being able to speak to other women that have diagnoses or even women that are just going through hard seasons of suffering, and to encourage them to just be able to speak more to those people and to give them that hope that I have found, and to even just continue in ministry. Doing our disability ministry is such a gift. It's just something I do as a volunteer right now, but I could just see the Lord growing that in the future to even where I can be doing full-time ministry as my job.
Yeah. How has certain different spiritual practices kind of been a part of your life? Has that changed over time? Things of like, oh, this feels really good for this season. We're like, actually, I don't like memorization, never doing that again. What would be something that for you, Sarah, you find really comforting and helpful for your own spiritual faith?
Worship for me is probably the way I feel the most connected to God, and that's listening to worship music as often and in every place that I can. So I feel like that is probably the number one way that I connect to God. I also really feel close to Him through being in community and hearing what other believers are experiencing or what they're learning about God in hard seasons. And specifically, I think hearing a testimony of what He's doing in another believer's life gives me that confidence to trust Him and believe that He's still moving, even when I don't have that feeling that He's moving. Yeah. So reading the Word is obviously so important, but scripture memorization, all that, I feel like it's not as, I don't feel it as much sometimes. It's when I'm either in worship with the Lord or just being in community with other believers.
Yeah, absolutely. Circling back to your parents, if you don't mind me asking, you said your mom was Catholic, your dad is Jewish, and now Sarah is a Christian. So what was that process like of sharing your faith with your family? Were they accepting of that? Has it been an interesting catalyst in your relationship?
It's something that I really desire to do more of. I think there's always that fear of sharing and being rejected for what I believe, but even to just have opportunities to answer their questions about Christianity, which I'm able to do, or even just teach my parents the understanding of the Bible has been really cool. I would say when I did get baptized in college, that was a big, being in the Catholic Church, like, you've already been baptized and you've already been confirmed Catholic, so you don't need to get baptized again. And explaining to them that that wasn't my decision. That was something that was traditional in the Catholic Church. And this was something that I was choosing for me to really just show my development with the Lord and my commitment to the Lord. And so that was a very hard thing for them to understand. But ultimately, they came around and supported me in that. So I really pray every single day that I could just be a light and the hope to my family. And I know that they can see by the way that I handle certain circumstances due to disability that just doesn't make any sense, because I should be upset about things. I should be, bitter, as the world would say. But I think even just through my actions in that shows them a light that they haven't seen.
Sarah, tell me more about, you had said you are a co-visionary on Even If, and I'd love to hear more about what that is.
Yeah. So my friend Renee Dallen-Mayer, she started during COVID a 4-week Bible study for just women locally in Ohio that had disabilities. And it actually ended up going way past those 4 weeks. And it has now grown into a ministry. We have hundreds of women that join us around the world. We have girls in Canada, girls in Europe, and it's not often that you find a community of believers or even non-Christian women that have so many varying diagnoses, but that's what brings them together. And so, yes, I have been in disability community my whole life, but to find a space where disability and faith combine for women is just something I cannot even explain how special that is. So just doing retreats and having speakers come in that have disabilities to encourage us, and even just getting to be a light and help women understand their identity in Jesus through disability and through suffering has been such a gift.
How has watching, obviously you have your own idea and feelings on suffering, but when you look at the Bible, and there's a lot of suffering in there, what does that mean? How have you grown from that? What have you learned from those messages of suffering in the Bible?
It provides comfort for me, ultimately, but I think we can all be human and say that when we're in a season of suffering, we are rebelling. And we don't really want to understand what the Lord is teaching us in our circumstances. And so for as often as I do have to battle that suffering, I am also a human that is in my flesh that wants to rebel and say, I'm going to be a little brat, Lord, and I don't want to understand what you're doing, and I'm going to go my own way. But he's always so gracious and patient that even when I'm prideful and don't want to choose him, he brings me back and just gives me a reminder through his spirit that, like, this is what he's teaching me, and I can fight it all day long. But the sooner I accept it, the more peace I will feel.
Talk to me a little bit about the rebellion, Sarah, because I mean,
real.
You guys can't see your face right now, but I mean, like, you look like a sweet girl. You look very kind. What does that rebellion look like for you? If you're willing to share that.
Of course.
And I'll think of mine while you're talking of like what rebellion looks like for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really choosing my flesh over knowing what the Spirit's calling me to. It's choosing to think that I have everything under control and I can do things better than God. And that sort of attitude of like, no, Lord, I got this, when he's sitting right next to me. And I just somehow put myself above him and make myself bigger than who he is, when ultimately he is above the name above all names. And so just over and over again, he has to humble me. And sometimes the hardest way is to say, no, Sarah, I'm right here. And I'm going to teach you the same lesson over and over. And I've never left you. In Judges 6, Gideon talks about, but Lord, all these things have happened to me. And where have you been? He's like, I've been right here and I'm going to stay right here. But how often just in our fleshly desires do we choose to go against the word, to go against or go towards our pride and really just turn from the Lord until he's like, hello, I'm right here. And you realize, okay, Lord, you've been here and you're trying to teach me something. Wow. I'm ready to listen.
That's so good. I think we're similar in the sense of I like to control things.
Oh, yeah.
I just, I want to do it my own. And I've tried to like think through, like, is that just because of culture? Is it my generation where girls were told, like, you can do anything you want to do, like, and girl power. And yeah, but I think that has seeped in. I've noticed it coming out a little bit. I can see we have a 14-year-old daughter, freshman in high school. Okay. You work with youth. I'm sure some people have some attitudes from time to time, but what I see through parenting, I'm like, oh, like this is how I'm acting to my parent, to my father. which is so humbling because, you think I'm like, oh, I figured that out today. And it's just, it's a repeated process over and over and over. Thanks for
It's
sharing.
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me too, wanting that independence aside from disability of I've got this. And my whole life, the world taught me to be as independent as possible. It was like, let's teach you how to dress yourself, teach you how to shower yourself. You can't depend on anybody. And it's the upside down kingdom of God where it's backwards. And he says, no, I want you to rely on me. Like, please don't do things independently. Like you are so dependent on me. So I can see where, for me, the worldly desire to be independent kind of fights with the flesh and the upside down kingdom of God.
I think by listening to your story today, Sarah, I see how all of these pieces like align into who God created you to be. And I'm excited to see where you will go in the political spectrum and how you continue to advocate. And even like the concept of community, like all of these pieces are coming together in such a beautiful way. And so I'm very excited for you. And what would you say like is coming up that you're looking forward to into 2025, if you can dream?
I haven't even started thinking about the new year yet. I would say our ministry is hosting a big conference in March. It'll be an all virtual conference. We've got some really great guests. I can't even tell you who they are because
that's okay.
They won't be announced until after this podcast is released. But just such strong women of God that are disabled and non-disabled that have chosen to come and support our ministry when we really don't have much money to give. And just for them to serve our community and give hope to women with disabilities, I think is going to be life-changing for a lot of them. So I'm excited. Even though I'm, helping to plan that, I think the life change and transformation in our community through that ministry is going to be, I'm pumped.
That is fantastic. I'm really excited for you. If people wanted to get connected to you, Sarah, what would be the best way that they could do that?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on Instagram, so you can follow me at sgoldman17. That's at sgoldman17. And if you want to learn more about Even If Ministries on Instagram, we are at We Are Even If.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Danielle.
I love to see Sarah's passion for advocating for those with disabilities and just how that has grown in her and what is to come for her future. I'm so excited. To connect with Sarah, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time together today. Number 1, Sarah mentioned people can get stuck into the mindset of using their diagnosis as an idol. So my question for you is, what idols are in place for you today that you need to surrender? Number 2, it's challenging to know that our suffering can be used for much more because sometimes we get kind of scared, like, is this even worth it? But I'd love for you to reflect on any past situations where you can now see that your suffering wasn't put to waste. As always, the editing skills that go into the production of the Parable Podcast are my favorite Christmas elf, my husband, Eric. Thanks so much, babe. Also, Merry Christmas. I pray you have a season where you can relax and remember what this birth of Christ means for all of mankind. Thank you so much for listening. It is such a joy to share these stories with you week after week. Remember, your parable showcases how God wants you to live on mission for Him. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.